Imagine two giants standing in a pitch-black room, back to back, unaware of the other's face, yet occasionally feeling the warmth of their other's breath against the cold air. For the better part of 2 centuries, this was the relationship between the Roman Empire and Han China. They were the 2 undisputed heavyweights of the ancient world, command centers of civilization that controlled nearly half of the human population between them. They were separated by 7,000 miles of unforgiving steppe, towering mountain ranges, and the jealous, gatekeeping empires of the Middle East. To the Romans, the land in the east was Syrica, the land of silk, a misty, semi-mythical place where the trees supposedly sprouted delicate golden fleece. To the Chinese, the land in the far west was Da Qin, or Great Qin, a mirror image of their own empire, where the people were tall, honest, and governed by a system of merit that looked suspiciously like their own idealized past. They were destined to meet, yet the tragedy of history is that they almost never did. This is the story of the one moment when the darkness in that room was briefly illuminated, the Roman embassy to the court of Emperor Juan in 166 AD. In the 2nd century, the Roman Empire was at its absolute zenith. Under the Nerva Antonine dynasty, the Mediterranean had become a Roman lake, and the Pax Romana ensured that a merchant could travel from the fog-swept wilds of Britain to the sun-scorched banks of the Nile with relative safety. But this stability came with a staggering appetite for luxury. In the marble-clad villas of the Roman elite, a new obsession had taken hold: silk. It was a material unlike anything the West had ever produced, light, shimmering, and possessing a tactile grace that made wool and linen feel like sackcloth. Pliny the Elder, the Roman naturalist and perpetual grumbler, lamented the drain on the imperial coffers, claiming that at least 100 million sesterces flowed out of the empire every year to purchase oriental luxuries. He complained that silk was so thin it did not hide a woman's body, but rather showcased her nakedness to the public. To the Roman Senate, silk was not just a fabric, it was a moral hazard and an economic hemorrhage. They were paying for it in pure gold and silver, and that wealth was disappearing into the east, never to return. The Romans, however, had no idea how silk was made. Their best guess was that it was a fine down found on the leaves of trees, which was then soaked in water and spun into thread. They were oblivious to the reality of the humble silkworm and the meticulously guarded industry of the Han Empire. This ignorance was maintained by a series of intermediaries who had a vested interest in keeping the 2 giants apart. The primary barrier was the Parthian Empire, situated in modern-day Iran and Iraq. The Parthians were the ultimate middlemen. They controlled the crossroads of the Silk Road, and they understood that if Rome and China ever established direct contact, the lucrative commissions of the transit trade would evaporate. The Parthians told the Romans that the journey east was impossible, filled with demons and impassable deserts. To the Chinese, they whispered that the sea to the west was vast and possessed a homesickness quality, that any sailor who ventured too far would be overcome by a longing for home so intense they would wither away and die. The Chinese were equally curious about the West. During the reign of the Han, particularly under the ambitious military leadership of General Banqiao, Chinese influence pushed deep into Central Asia. In 97 AD, Banqiao dispatched an envoy named Gan Ying to seek out the Great Qin. Gan Ying traveled through the Tiran Basin, crossed the Pamir mountain ranges, and eventually reached the shores of the Persian Gulf, likely in the territory of Messene. He was closer to Rome than any Chinese official had ever been. He stood on the edge of the known world, looking toward the horizon where the Roman province of Syria lay just a few weeks' journey away. But here, the Parthian sailors played their greatest trick. They told Gan Ying that the sea was so vast that it could take 2 years to cross, and that the voyage was so dangerous that men often lost their minds. Gan Ying, a land-based official from the heart of the Yellow Loess Plains, was intimidated by the prospect of the open ocean. He turned back, and the greatest chance for an early encounter between the 2 empires was lost to a Parthian lie. By the year 161 AD, the Roman world was changing. The philosopher Emperor Marcus Aurelius had ascended the throne, but his reign, despite its reputation for wisdom, was immediately besieged by crisis. A devastating plague, likely smallpox, was ripping through the legions, and the borders were being pressured by Germanic tribes. Simultaneously, across the world, the Han Empire was beginning its long, slow descent into factionalism and court intrigue under Emperor Juan. It was against this backdrop of internal stress that the most mysterious maritime expedition in history was launched. Whether it was a formal diplomatic mission sanctioned by Marcus Aurelius himself, or a group of enterprising Roman merchants from Egypt who realized they could cut out the Parthian middlemen by sailing south around India, is a question historians still debate. Regardless of the intent, a small group of men boarded a ship in the Red Sea and began a journey that would take them further from home than almost any Roman in history. The route was a grueling test of endurance. Leaving the Roman ports of Myos Hormos or Berenice, the travelers would have hugged the coast of the Arabian Peninsula before catching the monsoon winds across the Indian Ocean. These winds were the secret engine of ancient trade. If you timed them correctly, the ocean became a highway.
They stopped in the thriving ports of the Malabar coast, where Roman coins have been found in the thousands, evidence of a robust trade in pepper and spices. But instead of turning back with a cargo of black gold, this particular group pushed further east. They sailed around the southern tip of India, crossed the treacherous Bay of Bengal, and threaded the needle through the Strait of Malacca. They were entering the Golden Chersonese, the ancient name for the Malay Peninsula. Every mile took them further into a world that existed entirely outside the Roman imagination, a world of dense tropical jungles, strange deities, and a heat that felt like a physical weight. Finally, in the year 166 AD, this ragged band of travelers reached the Renan Commandery, a frontier outpost of the Han Empire located in what is now central Vietnam. To the local Chinese governor, they must have been a bizarre sight. Sun-reddened men with strange features, carrying gifts that were meant to impress the Son of Heaven. They claimed to be envoys of a king named Anton, the Chinese phonetic rendering of Antoninus, the family name of Marcus Aurelius. They had survived the vastness of the Indian Ocean and the predatory pirates of the South China Sea. They had bypassed the Parthian blockade by taking the long way around the world. As they stepped onto the muddy shores of the Han frontier, they were no longer just merchants or sailors. They were the first bridge between two worlds that had spent centuries dreaming of one another. The journey through the wilderness was over. The journey into the heart of the most sophisticated bureaucracy on earth was about to begin. They had arrived at the gates of the Forbidden City.
The governor of Renan was not a man accustomed to surprises. In the humid, peripheral reaches of the Han Empire, the arrival of merchant junks from the Champa coast or local chieftains bearing tribute was the standard rhythm of administrative life. But the men standing before him in the autumn of 166 AD represented a profound deviation from the known world. These were not the dark-skinned mariners of the Erythraean Sea or the familiar traders of the Indo-Pacific. These men were pale, weathered by a sun they were never meant to endure, and they spoke a tongue that sounded like the grinding of stones compared to the tonal elegance of the Han court. Yet they possessed a bearing that suggested they were not mere castaways. They carried themselves with the quiet, weary dignity of a people who belonged to an empire that, like China, believed itself to be the center of the universe. The processing of these Da-Chin envoys began not with a banquet, but with a meticulous bureaucratic interrogation. To the Han administration, order was the mandate of heaven, and no visitor could bypass the rituals of documentation. Through a series of grueling translations, shifting from Latin to Greek, from Greek to an Indo-Aryan dialect, from that to a Southern Yu language, and finally into the archaic Chinese of the governing class, the purpose of their visit crystallized. They were the emissaries of Antoon, the king of Da-Chin. In the mind of the governor, this was a momentous development. For centuries, the Han had heard whispers of a great power in the West, a great kin that mirrored their own sophistication, a place where the people were tall and honest, and where silk was unraveled and rewoven into garments of translucent beauty. However, as the governor inspected the gifts the strangers had brought, a flicker of disappointment must have crossed his face. The official records of the later Han Dynasty, the Ho Hanshu, preserve a note of this letdown. The Han court had long expected the legendary treasures of the West, the luminous night-shining pearls, the intricate Roman glasswork, and the storied sea silk woven from the secretions of Mediterranean mollusks. Instead, the men from Antoon presented ivory, rhinoceros horn, and tortoiseshell. These were valuable commodities, certainly, but they were the products of the southern seas, not the sophisticated workshops of a Western superpower. The governor's scribes noted this discrepancy with a cynical brushstroke. It appeared the envoys had been forced to purchase their tribute along the way, having perhaps lost their original cargo to the sea or the predatory hands of middlemen. Regardless, the protocols had to be followed. The governor drafted a report, sealed it with official vermilion, and dispatched a horseman toward the north. The journey to the capital, Loyang, would be nearly 2,000 miles, a trek through the dense jungles of the south and across the vast, silt-laden rivers of the interior. The Roman party was placed under the guardianship of a military escort and provided with carriages. As they began their ascent from the tropical fringes of Renan, the sheer scale of the Han infrastructure began to reveal itself to them. For men raised on the Appian Way and the architectural triumphs of Rome, the Chinese landscape offered a different kind of awe. They traveled along the imperial road system, a network of highways designed for the rapid movement of armies and information. Every 30 li they encountered a postal station where horses were exchanged and supplies replenished. The Romans, who took great pride in their own cursus publicus, recognized the familiar smell of a well-oiled empire. Yet the aesthetics were alien. Instead of the soaring marble arches and limestone columns of the Mediterranean, they saw a world built of timber, rammed earth, and gray ceramic tiles. The Chinese cities they passed through were organized into perfect rectangular grids, enclosed by massive walls of pounded earth that made the fortifications of the Roman limes look like garden fences.
As they moved through the Red River Delta and into the provinces of southern China, the climate began to shift. The stifling humidity of the coast gave way to the temperate foothills of the Nanling Mountains. The Romans observed the peasantry with the keen eyes of men who understood the value of land. They saw a countryside that was intensely, almost obsessively cultivated. Every inch of available earth was terraced or irrigated, supporting a population density that seemed to dwarf anything they had seen in the provinces of Gaul or Syria. They saw the water wheels of the Han, the sophisticated iron plows pulled by water buffalo, and the endless paddies of rice that shimmered like broken mirrors under the autumn sun. To the Romans, who relied on the grain of Egypt and North Africa to feed their capital, the agricultural productivity of the Han was a silent testament to the emperor's power. The journey was not merely a physical passage, but a collision of worldviews. The Roman envoys, likely led by a pragmatic merchant aristocrat who had been commissioned for this voyage, would have spent their evenings in the government guest houses, attempting to learn the intricacies of Han etiquette. They were told how to bow, how to hold their hands within their sleeves, and how to address the officials they encountered. The Han officials, in turn, were fascinated by the Romans' descriptions of their home. They asked about the Roman Senate, which they interpreted through their own lens as a council of elders, and they were particularly intrigued by the Roman practice of choosing their leaders by merit, a misunderstanding of the imperial succession that made Rome sound like a utopian reflection of the legendary Zhou dynasty. By the time the embassy crossed the Yangtze River, the long river that bisected the empire, the air had turned crisp. The lush greens of the south were replaced by the golden-brown hues of the central plains. This was the cradle of Chinese civilization, the Los Plateau where the soil was as yellow as the skin of the mythical first emperor. The Romans were now deep within the heart of the Han world. They crossed the Yellow River, a churning torrent of silt and history, via a massive pontoon bridge that stretched across the water like a tethered serpent. The scale of the engineering required to bridge such a river left no doubt in the Romans' minds. They were not in some barbarian kingdom, but in a state that possessed a mastery over nature equal to their own. Finally, the silhouette of Luoyang appeared on the horizon. It was a city of nearly 500,000 people, a sprawling metropolis of markets, temples, and government bureaus. The Romans approached from the south, their carriages rattling over the stone-paved road that led to the city's massive gates. They saw the towering watchtowers of the southern palace, their roofs decorated with glazed tiles that caught the fading light of the sun. The air was thick with the smell of coal smoke, incense, and the collective breath of 1,000 busy streets. As they passed through the outer walls, the Romans were met with the silent, curious stares of the Luoyang citizenry. To the locals, these men were barbarians from the Western Ocean, yet they were being treated with a level of official ceremony usually reserved for high-ranking dignitaries. The Romans, for their part, felt the weight of their mission. They were thousands of miles from the Forum, standing in a city where their language was gibberish and their gods were unknown. They had spent months in the belly of a bureaucratic machine that was now finally delivering them to its center. The gates of the southern palace loomed before them, a fortress of red wood and golden silk. Behind these walls sat Emperor Huan, the son of heaven, a man who believed that the entire world paid him homage. The Romans adjusted their tunics, tightened their belts, and prepared to present the greetings of Marcus Aurelius. They had survived the ocean and the wilderness, but now they faced a different kind of peril, the intricate, deadly, and ancient theater of the Han imperial court. The audience was about to begin.
The heavy resonance of a bronze bell shattered the silence of the inner courtyard, a deep, vibrating toll that seemed to pulse through the very stones of Luoyang. For the Romans, it was a sound unlike the clanging bells of their Mediterranean home. It was somber, rhythmic, and heavy with the weight of 1,000 years of ritual. As the sound faded, the massive cedar doors of the Hall of Extraordinary Clouds swung inward with a synchronized grace that suggested the invisible hand of a clockwork god. The Roman envoys, led by a man whose name history has obscured, but whose mission was now reaching its zenith, stepped forward. They moved with a deliberate pace, their leather-soled caligae clicking softly against the polished black tiles, a sharp contrast to the silent, silk-shod glides of Han attendants flanking them. The air inside the hall was thick with the scent of burning sandalwood and the faint metallic tang of aged bronze. As their eyes adjusted to the dim, filtered light of the interior, the Romans realized the sheer scale of the space. This was not the open, airy architecture of a Roman basilica or the marble-clad intimacy of the Palatine Hill. This was a forest of dark timber, where massive pillars, lacquered in deep vermilion and gold, reached up into a ceiling lost in shadow. High above, intricate coffered panels depicted the celestial bureaucracy, a mirror of the earthly one the Romans were currently navigating. At the far end of the hall, elevated on a multi-tiered dais, sat a figure draped in robes of such intricate embroidery that he seemed less like a man and more like a statue made of woven precious metals.
This was Emperor Huan, the 11th ruler of the Eastern Han Dynasty, the man the Romans called the King of Anton's counterpart, the Son of Heaven. The protocol of the Han court was a choreographed dance of submission and hierarchy. The Romans had been briefed for weeks by the regional governors and the court intermediaries in Renan, yet the reality of the situation was overwhelming. Every cough, every shift of weight, and every downward glance was monitored by the masters of ritual. To the Han officials, these foreigners were a curiosity, tall, bearded, and possessing high noses, but they were still seen through the lens of the tributary system. In the Chinese worldview, there were no equal nations. There was only the Middle Kingdom and the barbarians who orbited it. The Romans, however, carried the internal pride of a people who believed they had conquered the world. They were the heirs of Augusta and Trajan, representatives of an empire that stretched from the rainy fogs of Britain to the scorching sands of the Euphrates. Standing before the Han Emperor, two civilizations were finally meeting, but they were speaking two entirely different languages of power. The silence was broken not by the emperor, but by a high-ranking eunuch standing to his right. His voice was shrill and melodic as he announced the arrival of the envoys from Da Qing, the Great Qing, a name the Chinese had given to the Roman Empire because they believed its people were tall and honest like the Chinese of old. Through a series of translators, likely a chain of speakers moving from Latin to Greek, then to Palmyrene or Parthian, and finally into the courtly dialect of Han Chinese, the Roman leader began his address. He spoke of the great king Marcus Aurelius, whom the Chinese records would later name Anton, a transliteration of Antoninus. He spoke of a desire for friendship, for the opening of borders, and for the exchange of wisdom between the two ends of the inhabited world. Yet, as the words were filtered through the layers of translation, their meaning shifted. The Roman request for a diplomatic alliance was interpreted by the Han scribes as a humble petition for vassalage. The gifts the Romans had brought were now called tribute. This was the moment of truth for the embassy, the moment where the physical evidence of Roman greatness was to be displayed. The envoys gestured to their attendants, who stepped forward carrying several ornate boxes. In the Roman mind, these gifts were carefully chosen to represent the exotic reaches of their trade networks. But when the lids were lifted, a murmur ran through the assembled Han officials, not of awe, but of polite confusion. Inside the boxes lay pieces of ivory, rhinoceros horn, and tortoiseshell. To a Roman merchant in the markets of Alexandria or Antioch, these were high-value luxuries, symbols of the empire's reach into Africa and the Deep South. But to the Han court, these were common commodities. They were items produced in the southern commanderies of the Han Empire itself, in the jungles of Vietnam and the shores of the South China Sea. The Han officials looked at the tribute from the legendary Da Qing and saw nothing that they did not already possess in abundance. Where was the legendary Roman glass? Where were the cloth that could be cleaned by fire, asbestos, or the intricate mechanical marvels they had heard stories of? The historical record preserved in the Hu Han Shu, or the Book of the Later Han, notes this moment with a touch of skepticism. The Chinese chroniclers recorded that the tribute contained no jewels at all, leading many to suspect that the envoys were not official ambassadors from the Roman Senate, but rather enterprising merchants who had lost their original cargo at sea or had simply fabricated their credentials to gain an audience with the emperor. Whether they were truly legates of Marcus Aurelius or merely clever traders from the Roman East, the effect was the same. The Han were unimpressed. The myth of Da Qing, the western twin of China, began to crack under the reality of these weathered men and their mundane offerings. Despite the disappointment of the gifts, Emperor Huan remained an enigma of imperial poise. He did not mock the envoys. Instead, he maintained a long view of a dynasty that measured time in centuries. He asked questions, relayed through the translators, about the geography of the West. He wanted to know of the flying bridges of the Roman cities and the system of governance where, as the Han heard it, the rulers were chosen based on merit rather than birth, a misunderstanding of the Roman senatorial and imperial selection process that fascinated the Chinese scholars. The Romans tried to describe the forum, the aqueducts, and the legions, but the concepts often failed to translate. A senator became a village elder. A legion became a group of guards. The grandeur of Rome was being shrunk to fit the vocabulary of the Han bureaucracy. As the audience stretched into its second hour, the physical strain began to show on the Romans. The heat of Luoyang's autumn was stifling, and the rigid posture required by the court was agonizing. Yet they stayed focused. They were observing the Han just as intensely as they were being observed. They saw the emperor's inner circle, the powerful eunuchs who, unbeknownst to the foreigners, were the real masters of the palace, slowly strangling the power of the traditional scholar officials. They saw the intricate silk robes, the quality of which surpassed anything found in the markets of Rome, and they realized that while they had come to civilize or trade, they were standing in a society that was, in many ways, more technologically sophisticated than their own. The audience finally drew to a close with a formal dismissal. The emperor rose, his jade pendants clinking softly, and vanished behind a screen of golden silk. The Romans were let out, not through the grand central door, but through a side gate, a subtle sign that while they had been received, They had not been honored as equals. As they stepped back into the blinding sunlight of the palace courtyards, the weight of their situation settled upon them. They had reached the heart of the world. They had looked into the eyes of the Son of Heaven, and they had survived. But as they were escorted back to their guest quarters, they realized that the hardest part of their journey was not the ocean or the mountains. It was the realization that in this vast golden land, Rome was not the center of the universe. It was merely a distant, curious speck on the horizon of the Han imagination. The embassy was not an end, but a beginning of a much more complex and quiet struggle for recognition.
The guest quarters, located within the sprawling complex of the Honglu Sea, or the Ministry of State Ceremonies, offered a quietude that felt heavy with the weight of unsaid things. As the Roman envoys settled onto their low wooden stools, the silk tapestries on the walls seemed to shiver in the evening draft, their intricate patterns of dragons and clouds mocking the foreigners' simple woolen tunics. For months, they had envisioned this moment as a meeting of titans, a diplomatic bridge between the two greatest powers the world had ever known. Yet, as the tea cooled in their ceramic cups, the reality of their reception began to curdle their initial relief. They had been treated not as ambassadors from a rival superpower, but as curious subordinates from a remote fringe, arriving at the feet of the only true civilization. The Roman leader, a man whose name is lost to the tides of the Mediterranean, but who likely bore the rugged stoicism of the late Antonine period, looked at the pile of gifts they had presented earlier that day. There was ivory, rhinoceros horn, and tortoiseshell, treasures they had painstakingly sourced during their long, arduous transit through the ports of Southeast Asia. To the Romans, these items were the height of exotic luxury, symbols of a far-reaching trade network that spanned the Indian Ocean. However, to the Han court, these were common commodities of the southern frontiers. The Chinese records would later note, with a hint of scholarly disdain, that the embassy brought no jewels or curiosities, suggesting that the Roman descriptions of their home's legendary wealth might have been mere exaggerations. The very gifts meant to impress the emperor had inadvertently signaled that Rome was a land of limited means, or at the very least, a land that did not understand the true nature of Han splendor. In the days following the audience, the Romans were not permitted to roam the city of Luoyang at will. They remained under a form of polite house arrest, attended to by scholars and scribes who were more interested in categorizing them than in learning from them. These Han officials were obsessed with the concept of Da Qin, the Great Qin. For centuries, the Chinese had imagined a mirror image of themselves in the far west, a place where the people were tall and honest, where the cities were laid out in perfect grids, and where the rulers were chosen by merit rather than blood.